Begin in silence, a dim bedroom. Daniel's belongings are still exactly where he left them. His old watch sits on the bedside table. His reading glasses remain beside an unopened book. A dark suit hangs behind the bedroom door, the same suit Eleanor had chosen for his funeral. Eleanor, 78, is standing alone in the room. She has spent the past 3 days avoiding this particular drawer, not because it contains anything frightening, because it contains the last things Daniel ever touched. She finally opens it. Inside are ordinary things, old receipts, a fountain pen, cufflinks, a small leather wallet, photographs, folded papers. Then something catches her attention. A photograph. She pulls it out. At first, she smiles. She assumes it is another picture from Daniel's youth, but the smile disappears almost immediately. Daniel is young, perhaps 26 or 27. He is standing outside a small house. Beside him is a young woman Eleanor has never seen, and in Daniel's arms, a baby. Eleanor turns the photograph over. Written on the back in Daniel's handwriting are 3 things. June 14th, 1974. Rose, Thomas. Eleanor stares at the names. She knows neither of them, but the date means something. It was only 4 months before Daniel proposed to her. She whispers, "Who is Rose?" Then she looks at the baby. Her voice becomes almost inaudible. And who is Thomas? But the question that hurts the most isn't about the woman. It isn't even about the child, it's about Daniel. Because for 52 years, Eleanor had believed she knew the man she married. And now, 3 days after burying him, she was looking at proof that there had been a part of his life she had never known existed. For 52 years, Eleanor believed her marriage had survived every secret life could throw at them. She was wrong. Then, because this photograph was only the beginning, and before Eleanor discovered who Rose and Thomas were, she would uncover a truth that would force her to question the entire story of her marriage. Eleanor, a woman who has spent most of her life building a family. She isn't wealthy, she isn't famous, she doesn't consider herself extraordinary. Her world has always been simple. A house, a husband, children, grandchildren, Sunday dinners, birthdays, Christmas photographs, quiet evenings. And Daniel. Daniel always drank his coffee from the same chipped blue mug. He never remembered where he put his keys. He used to leave the last piece of toast for Eleanor, even when she knew he wanted it. Every winter, he complained about the cold, while refusing to wear a proper coat. Eleanor was 25, Daniel was 27. They met at a small community gathering. Daniel wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was quiet, observant. He listened when Eleanor spoke. That was what attracted her. Within a year, they were married. Within several years, they had children. Their lives became ordinary, but meaningful. Their marriage had never been perfect, but it had always felt honest. Did Daniel cheat? How well can you know someone after loving them for half a century? Claire, 48, Eleanor's daughter, protective of her mother, practical, sometimes impatient. Michael, 45, Eleanor's son, more emotionally distant but deeply attached to his mother. The family has just experienced Daniel's funeral. Everyone believes Eleanor's grief is the reason she has become withdrawn. They don't know she's about to discover something that may change how they remember him. Eleanor places the photograph on the bed. She doesn't immediately tell anyone. Instead, she continues searching. Why? Because something bothers her. The photograph was hidden, not stored with the family albums, not inside a drawer Eleanor regularly used. It was inside a small, locked wooden box. She searches Daniel's belongings for the key. Eventually, she finds it taped underneath an old desk drawer. That detail immediately raises the stakes. Daniel deliberately locked this away. Eleanor opens it. Inside, the photograph Daniel, Rose, and the baby. A handwritten letter. The envelope is yellow with age. It is addressed simply, Daniel, no sender's name, a hotel receipt, a hotel in another city. Date, June 1974, the same month as the photograph. A small folded piece of paper on it. is a woman's name, Rose Bennett. She tries to rationalize everything. Maybe Rose was a friend. Maybe the baby belonged to someone else. Maybe Daniel was helping someone. Maybe there was an explanation. She wants to protect the memory of her husband. She tells herself, there has to be another explanation. Then she notices something. The handwriting on the photograph is unmistakably Daniel's, and underneath the date are two words, "Forgive me." Eleanor begins investigating quietly. She doesn't want Claire or Michael to know yet. She searches through 50 years of photographs, wedding photographs, birthdays, Christmases, anniversaries, family holidays, Daniel's younger years. But there is no Rose, no Thomas, nothing. It is as though those people never existed. Eleanor looks at the date again, June 14th, 1974. She remembers that summer, because she had written about it in an old diary. Daniel had told her he was away for work. He had said he needed to travel to another city for several days. At the time, Eleanor hadn't questioned it. They weren't married yet. She had trusted him. Now she goes searching for the diary. She finds it. Inside is an entry. Daniel called tonight. He says he'll be back Friday. Eleanor freezes, because the photograph is dated Wednesday. She looks at the hotel receipt again. Daniel hadn't been working. He had stayed at a hotel for 3 nights, and the address is in the same city where Rose lived. Now the story becomes personal. Eleanor isn't investigating a stranger's secret anymore. She is investigating her own husband. She discovers one more thing. The hotel receipt has a handwritten note on the back. 4 words. She wouldn't let me. Eleanor reads it twice. Then again, she doesn't understand. Who was she? What wouldn't she let Daniel do? And why did he feel the need to write it down? Eleanor stared at the letter for several seconds before finally opening it. Her hands were trembling, not because she was afraid of what the paper might say, but because some part of her already knew that whatever was written inside could never be unread. For 52 years she had carried the memories of her marriage like carefully preserved photographs, their first meeting, their wedding day, the birth of their children, the difficult years, the good years, the ordinary evenings when Daniel would sit across from her at the kitchen table and ask how her day had been. She had believed those memories belonged to a complete story. Now, sitting alone in the kitchen, Eleanor wondered whether they had ever been complete at all. She unfolded the letter. The paper was old and slightly yellowed. Daniel's handwriting covered the page, and the first sentence stopped her cold. "If you're reading this, Eleanor, then I'm finally gone, and there is something you deserve to know." Eleanor lowered the letter. For a moment, she couldn't continue. She looked toward the empty chair where Daniel had sat almost every evening for decades. It was still there. The same chair, the same worn armrests, the same small mark on the wooden floor where one of its legs had rested for years. Everything around her looked exactly as it had before, except now nothing felt the same, because the man she had buried 3 days earlier was beginning to speak to her from the past. And what he had to say began more than 50 years ago. Eleanor was 25 when she first met Daniel. She had no idea that the quiet young man standing across a crowded room would eventually become the person she would spend more than half a century beside. At 25, Eleanor still believed life had a simple rhythm. You grew up, you met someone, you fell in love, you built a home, and if you were lucky, you grew old together. She had no idea how complicated love could become. Daniel was 27. He wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. He didn't tell the loudest stories. He didn't try to impress everyone around him. He listened. That was what Eleanor noticed first. When she spoke, Daniel paid attention, not the distracted kind of attention people give while waiting for their turn to speak. He actually listened, and Eleanor remembered that. Years later, she would still remember the first evening they spent talking. They spoke until the room had almost emptied. By the time Eleanor realized how late it had become, Daniel was already walking her home. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no promises about forever, just two young people walking slowly through the night, talking about their hopes and fears, as though they had known each other much longer than a few hours. That was how it began, quietly, naturally, and perhaps that was why Eleanor trusted it so completely. Daniel made her feel safe. He made her laugh. He remembered small things she said. He knew when she was worried, even when she pretended not to be. Within months, their relationship had become serious, and before long, Daniel asked her to marry him. Eleanor said yes. She never imagined that another woman might have been standing somewhere in the shadows of that same period of his life. She certainly never imagined that one day, more than 50 years later, she would be sitting at her kitchen table, trying to understand who that woman had been. Their wedding day became one of Eleanor's most treasured memories. She remembered Daniel looking nervous. She remembered the way he smiled when he saw her walking toward him. She remembered his hands shaking slightly when he took hers. And she remembered thinking that she had found the person she would grow old with. For decades, that memory had been enough. Their marriage wasn't perfect. There were arguments. There were financial struggles. There were years when raising children consumed nearly every waking moment. There were nights when they were too tired to talk. There were moments when Eleanor wondered whether Daniel truly understood her, but they always found their way back to each other. They built a home, they raised Claire, then Michael. They watched their children grow up, they celebrated graduations, they attended weddings, they became grandparents. Daniel held their grandchildren in the same arms that Eleanor had once believed belonged entirely to the life they had built together. And that was what made the photograph so painful, because it didn't simply suggest that Daniel had once loved someone else. It suggested that before Eleanor became his wife, there had been an entire chapter of his life that he had never shared with her. A chapter that might have contained a woman, a child, and perhaps a decision that had shaped everything that came afterward. Eleanor had always believed she knew where her marriage began. Now she was beginning to wonder whether she had ever known where Daniel's story truly began. Eleanor didn't tell Claire immediately. She spent the next morning carrying the photograph from room to room. She placed it on the dining table, then moved it to the kitchen counter, then returned it to the table. Every time she looked at it, she saw something different. Daniel's expression, the woman's face, the baby, the date. Finally, she called Claire. Her daughter arrived less than an hour later. Claire had spent the last several days worrying about her mother. She thought Eleanor was simply struggling with grief. She had no idea that her mother's grief had just acquired another layer. Eleanor placed the photograph on the table. Claire looked at it. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she picked it up. She studied Daniel's younger face. At first she seemed confused. Then she turned the photograph over. Her expression changed. Eleanor watched her daughter read the words on the back. Rose. Thomas, June 14, 1974. Claire looked at her mother. For the first time, Eleanor saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Claire tried to find an innocent explanation. Perhaps Rose had been a friend. Perhaps the child belonged to someone else. Perhaps Daniel had simply been helping a family during a difficult time. Eleanor wanted to believe that too. She desperately wanted to. But then she showed Claire the hotel receipt, the same date, the same city, the same year, and suddenly, the innocent explanations became harder to hold on to. Claire looked at the photograph again. Then she asked the question Eleanor had been avoiding. What if Dad had another family? Eleanor didn't answer, because once the question had been spoken aloud, it became impossible to pretend it didn't exist. Michael arrived later that afternoon. Claire had told him only enough to make him concerned. When he saw the photograph, his reaction was different. He didn't try to explain it away. He stared at it. Then he looked at the date, then at his mother, and finally at the handwriting. Michael had spent his entire life believing his father was exactly who he appeared to be, a hard-working husband, a devoted father, a quiet man who had made mistakes but had always been there for his family. Now Michael wondered whether the family had been built on a secret none of them had known about. The three of them sat around the table. Nobody knew what to say. Claire believed there might be an explanation. Michael thought there probably was a betrayal. Eleanor sat between them, listening. She didn't want to accuse Daniel without knowing the truth, but she couldn't ignore what was in front of her. The photograph, the letter, the hotel receipt, the name Rose, and the baby. Eventually, Eleanor made a decision. She wasn't going to destroy Daniel's memory. She wasn't going to accuse him. She wasn't even going to tell the rest of the family yet. She was simply going to find out what happened, because after 52 years of marriage, she believed she had earned the right to know the truth. And if Daniel had carried this secret to his grave, Eleanor was determined to bring it back into the light. The first clue came from someone Eleanor hadn't thought about in decades. Her name was Margaret. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the same town as Daniel when they were young. Eleanor remembered meeting her only once or twice, but Claire found an old address, and the following afternoon, Eleanor went to see her. Margaret was nearly 90. She moved slowly. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but when Eleanor mentioned Daniel's name, something changed in her expression. She remembered him immediately, not as the older man Eleanor had known, but as the young man he had once been. Margaret studied the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at Eleanor. She didn't ask where Eleanor had found it. She didn't ask why Eleanor was looking for answers now. Instead, she quietly said Rose's name. For Eleanor, hearing it from someone else's mouth made everything suddenly real. Rose had existed. She wasn't a stranger created by an old photograph. She had been part of Daniel's life. Margaret told Eleanor that Daniel and Rose had been close, very close. Closer than Eleanor had ever imagined. They had known each other before Daniel met Eleanor, and there had been a time when everyone around them expected Daniel and Rose to marry. Then something happened, something that changed everything. Eleanor leaned forward. She wanted to know what had happened, but Margaret stopped. She told Eleanor there were some things she wasn't certain she had the right to reveal. Some secrets had belonged to people who were no longer alive, and some truths, Margaret said, had consequences even after 50 years. Eleanor asked one final question. Did Daniel love her? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the photograph. Then she said something that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Yes, the word felt heavier than Eleanor expected. Daniel had loved Rose, but Margaret wasn't finished. She added that Daniel had also loved Eleanor. That was what made the story complicated. Eleanor left Margaret's house with more questions than answers. But there was one thing she now knew for certain. Rose had not been an insignificant person from Daniel's past. She had mattered, and whatever happened between them had happened shortly before Daniel married Eleanor. That evening, Eleanor returned home and searched through the documents she had collected. She found Rose's full name, Rose Bennett. She searched through old records, nothing. She searched through newspapers from the town where Daniel had lived, nothing. Then Claire found an old community newsletter. There was a short announcement from 1974. Eleanor read it once, then again, and a third time. The announcement mentioned a young woman named Rose Bennett. It didn't say much, only that she had left town. But underneath the announcement was a reference to a local maternity hospital. Eleanor's heart began to race. She searched further. Eventually, she found a birth record. The date matched the photograph. The mother's name was Rose Bennett. The father's name was not listed. Eleanor stared at the document. The room suddenly seemed very quiet. For 52 years, she had believed Daniel's only children were Claire and Michael. But the photograph had shown a baby. Margaret had confirmed Daniel and Rose had been in love. The date matched. The city matched. And now there was a birth record. A child had been born to Rose. A child whose birth occurred only months before Daniel married Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the photograph one more time. Daniel was holding the baby, not standing beside the baby, not looking at the baby from a distance, holding him, and suddenly, the name written on the back seemed impossible to ignore. Thomas. Eleanor slowly sat down. She realized she had spent the entire afternoon searching for evidence of an affair, but she might have been looking for something much bigger. A child, a son, someone who could have grown up never knowing the truth about his father, someone who might now be an old man himself. Eleanor looked toward Daniel's empty chair. For the first time since his funeral, she felt something stronger than grief. She felt anger, but beneath the anger was something else. Fear, because if Thomas was Daniel's son, then somewhere in the world there was a man who had spent his entire life carrying a question Eleanor had only just begun to ask. And there was one question Eleanor was no longer able to escape. Did Daniel know he had a son? She looked back at the letter sitting on the table, the letter he had written before his death, the letter he had specifically addressed to her, and suddenly, Eleanor understood why Daniel had hidden the photograph. He hadn't simply been hiding Rose, he had been hiding a life that had existed before Eleanor, a life that might have continued without her knowing. She opened the letter again. Her eyes moved slowly across the first paragraph. Then she reached the final sentence. Her breathing stopped, because Daniel had written, "Eleanor, there is a man you have never met, and he has your eyes." Eleanor dropped the letter. For 52 years, she had believed she was the only woman Daniel had ever built a life with. Now she knew there was a child. And somewhere beyond the walls of her quiet home, that child had grown old, without knowing the whole truth. But finding him would force Eleanor to confront a question she wasn't prepared to answer. What if Daniel had never actually abandoned his first family? And more importantly, what if Thomas had been searching for his father all along? The words stayed with Eleanor long after she had finished reading them. "There is a man you have never met, and he has your eyes." She read the sentence again, then again. Her fingers tightened around the paper. For several minutes, she simply sat there. She had spent the last few days searching for evidence of an affair. Now she was staring at proof that Daniel had known about a child who had apparently lived an entire lifetime without being part of the family Eleanor had built with him. But there was something else that frightened her. Daniel hadn't written that Thomas had his eyes. He had written that Thomas had Eleanor's eyes. Why? How could a man who wasn't related to her by blood possibly have the same eyes? Unless Daniel had known something Eleanor didn't. And suddenly, the search became more urgent. The next morning, Eleanor called Michael. She didn't tell him everything over the phone. She simply asked him to come over. When he arrived, she placed Daniel's letter in front of him. Michael read the sentence. His expression changed. He looked at his mother, then back at the paper. For the first time, neither of them tried to find an innocent explanation. They needed facts. So they began searching. They started with the birth records. The date from the photograph led them back to the hospital in the same city where Rose had lived. The records were old. Some were handwritten, some had been transferred between offices, others had been archived decades ago. It took hours to find anything useful, but eventually they found it, a birth record. The mother's name was exactly what they expected, Rose Bennett. The date matched the photograph. The location matched Daniel's hotel receipt, and the child was listed as Thomas Bennett. Eleanor stared at the document. Her heart was beating faster. There was only one problem. The father's name had been left blank. Michael leaned closer. There was no Daniel, no father's signature, nothing. It was as though Thomas had entered the world without a father. But Eleanor knew better. She had seen Daniel holding him. She had seen the date. She had read the letter. And she had heard Margaret confirm that Daniel and Rose had been deeply involved. Michael began searching for additional records. School records, marriage records, local newspaper archives, anything that could tell them what happened to Thomas after his birth. At first, there was almost nothing. Then, Michael found a small reference in an old newspaper. It mentioned Rose Bennett leaving the area shortly after Thomas was born. There was no explanation, no address, no mention of Daniel. But one detail stood out. Rose had not taken Thomas with her. Eleanor felt a chill move through her. She looked at Michael. Where was the baby? They kept searching, and eventually they found the answer. Thomas had been adopted. The discovery changed everything. Until that moment, Eleanor had imagined Thomas growing up somewhere with Rose. She had imagined Daniel occasionally wondering about him, perhaps secretly visiting him, perhaps sending money, perhaps simply living with the guilt of knowing he had a son somewhere in the world. But adoption meant something different. Thomas had been separated from his biological mother when he was still an infant, and if Daniel had known about the adoption, then he had lived for decades knowing that his own child was growing up somewhere under another family's name. Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about that. What kind of man could live with such a secret? What had happened between Daniel and Rose? Why had they given up their child? And why had Daniel never told Eleanor? The adoption records were difficult to access. Decades had passed. Privacy laws protected the identities of the people involved. Michael made calls. He submitted requests. He searched public archives. Every lead seemed to end at another locked door. For several days, nothing happened. Then an envelope arrived. It contained a small amount of information, not enough to tell the whole story, but enough to give them a name. Thomas had been adopted by a couple named Robert and Helen Carter. He had grown up as Thomas Carter. Eleanor whispered the name, Thomas Carter. That was the name of the baby in Daniel's photograph. The child Daniel had held more than 50 years earlier. The child whose existence Eleanor had never known. Michael began searching for him. There were several men with that name. Most were too young. Some lived in different states. Others had no connection to the city where Thomas had been raised. Then Michael found a record that made Eleanor's heart stop. A Thomas Carter, now 78 years old, lived less than 2 hours away. He had been married. He had children. He had grandchildren. He had worked most of his life as a teacher. He had lived an ordinary life, a completely separate life. And according to the records, he had never legally changed his surname. Eleanor stared at his photograph. The face was older now, much older. But there was something familiar about the eyes. She couldn't explain it. She simply knew. This was him. This was the baby Daniel had held. This was Thomas. Finding Thomas was one thing. Calling him was another. Eleanor spent 2 nights thinking about it. She imagined the conversation. She imagined telling him that his biological father had died. She imagined telling him that Daniel had been married for 52 years. She imagined the confusion, the anger, the questions. And she imagined Thomas asking the one question Eleanor feared most. Why didn't my father come for me? What could she say? She didn't know. She wasn't even certain Daniel had been allowed to come for him. And she didn't know why Rose had disappeared. She only knew that an old photograph had opened a door into a life she had never known existed. Eleanor almost decided not to call. Perhaps some secrets were better left buried. Perhaps Thomas had built a good life. Perhaps disturbing it would be selfish. But then she remembered Daniel's letter. There is a man you have never met. Daniel had known Eleanor would eventually find him. Maybe that was why he had left the letter. Maybe he wanted her to make the decision he had been too afraid to make. The following morning, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table. She placed Thomas's number beside the telephone. Her hand hovered over the phone. She stopped. Then she picked it up. One number, then another. Her heart pounded. She nearly hung up before the final number, but then the line began ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. A man's voice answered. Eleanor couldn't speak. For several seconds, neither of them said anything. Then she finally whispered, "My name is Eleanor." There was silence. She continued, "I was married to a man named Daniel." The silence on the other end became heavier. Then Thomas said something that Eleanor never expected. "I know." Eleanor froze. She hadn't even mentioned why she was calling. She hadn't said Daniel's surname. She hadn't explained the photograph. She hadn't told him about Rose. Yet Thomas knew exactly who she meant. Eleanor's voice trembled. "How? Thomas took a long breath. Then he said, "Because my mother told me." Eleanor closed her eyes. Rose had known, Thomas had known, and suddenly Eleanor realized she might be the only person in the story who had been kept completely in the dark. They agreed to meet 3 days later. Eleanor chose a quiet cafe halfway between their homes. She arrived early. She sat near the window. For several minutes, she watched strangers walk past. Every elderly man made her wonder whether it was Thomas. Then she saw him. He walked slowly through the entrance. He was tall, gray-haired, slightly stooped. He looked like a man who had lived a long and ordinary life, but when he turned toward Eleanor, she saw the eyes, the same eyes from the photograph, and for one strange moment, Eleanor felt as though time had folded in on itself. She wasn't looking at a 78-year-old stranger. She was looking at the baby Daniel had once held. Thomas sat across from her. Neither knew how to begin. Eleanor finally placed the photograph on the table. Thomas looked at it. He didn't appear surprised. Instead, he smiled sadly. "I've seen that picture before," he said. Eleanor's heart sank. She asked how. Thomas explained that Daniel had shown it to him years earlier, not once, several times. Eleanor stared at him. Daniel had contacted Thomas, not after his death, not near the end of his life, years earlier. Thomas told Eleanor that Daniel had found him when he was already an adult. He had come alone, no family, no explanation, just Daniel. Thomas had initially refused to believe him, but Daniel had brought documents, photographs, letters, proof. For the first time in his life, Thomas knew the identity of his biological father. Daniel had told him everything he could, but not everything. There was one thing Daniel had refused to explain. Why had he never told Eleanor? Thomas said Daniel had asked him to keep the meeting private. He had told Thomas that Eleanor didn't deserve to be hurt by a secret that had begun before their marriage. But Thomas remembered something else, something Eleanor hadn't expected. Daniel had told him, "I didn't stay away because I didn't love you." Thomas looked directly at Eleanor. Then he continued, "He said he stayed away because he was trying to protect someone." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Protect someone? Who? Rose? Thomas? Eleanor? Daniel had spent 52 years hiding the truth. But perhaps the secret wasn't about protecting himself. Perhaps it wasn't even about hiding an affair. Thomas reached into his coat. He removed an old envelope. It was worn at the edges. The handwriting was Daniel's. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Thomas placed it on the table. "This is the last letter he ever gave me." Eleanor stared at the envelope. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She had believed Daniel's letter to her was the final piece of the puzzle. Now she realized it wasn't. There was another letter, another story, another version of the truth, and Thomas had kept it for years. Eleanor looked up. "What did he tell you about me?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the envelope, then back at Eleanor. "He told me something about the woman you were before you married him." Eleanor's expression changed. She had never told Thomas about her younger life. She had barely told Daniel everything herself. Yet somehow, Daniel had connected Thomas to a part of Eleanor's past that she had long forgotten, and suddenly the mystery became larger than Rose, larger than the child, larger than Daniel's secret. There was something about Eleanor herself buried inside the story. Thomas slowly pushed the envelope toward her. Eleanor placed her hand on it, but before she opened it, Thomas said, "There is something you should know first." She looked at him. Thomas's voice was quiet. "Your husband wasn't hiding me from you." He paused. "He was hiding someone else from you." Eleanor's heart began to pound. For the first time, she understood that she had been asking the wrong question. The mystery wasn't simply, why did Daniel hide his son? The real question was, who had Daniel been protecting all those years? And whatever the answer was, it had been important enough for him to carry the secret for more than 5 decades. Eleanor looked down at the unopened letter. She realized she was no longer searching for proof that Daniel had betrayed her. She was searching for the reason he had sacrificed the truth. And the answer was sitting inside that envelope, waiting. But when Eleanor finally opened it, she would discover that Daniel's greatest secret had nothing to do with another woman. It had everything to do with a decision made before their marriage, a decision that would change the way Eleanor remembered the beginning of their love story forever. Eleanor stared at the envelope Thomas had placed in front of her. For a moment she couldn't bring herself to open it. She had spent days searching for the truth. She had followed names through old records. She had uncovered a child. She had found Thomas. And now, sitting across from the son Daniel had hidden from her, she was finally holding the letter that might explain everything. But Thomas's last words continued to echo in her mind. Daniel wasn't hiding Thomas from her. He had been hiding someone else. Eleanor slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. Daniel. She began reading. Daniel's letter began with an apology. Not an apology for loving Rose. Not an apology for Thomas. An apology for the silence. He explained that when he first met Rose, they were young and deeply in love. They believed they would spend their lives together. They made plans. They talked about marriage. They imagined a home. And then Rose became pregnant. Daniel wanted to marry her. He wanted to acknowledge the child. He wanted to build a family with her. But everything changed after Rose told him she had made a decision. She didn't want to marry him. She didn't want him to follow her. And most importantly, she didn't want him to interfere with the future she had planned for the child. Daniel wrote that he didn't understand her decision at first. He begged her to reconsider. He told her he would accept whatever difficulties came with raising a child. He didn't care about money. He didn't care about what other people thought. He only wanted his son. But Rose refused. She told him that if he stayed, everything would become worse. Daniel didn't understand what she meant until she showed him a letter from someone Daniel had known for years, someone connected to his family, someone who had discovered the pregnancy, and someone who had threatened to expose the situation if Daniel tried to marry Rose. Eleanor stopped reading. Her eyes moved back over the paragraph. There was a part of the story Daniel had never told her. The situation had not simply been about two young lovers separating. There had been pressure, fear, and a decision. Daniel continued. He wrote that Rose believed the only way to protect Thomas was to disappear. She believed that if Daniel remained involved, the child would become the center of a scandal that could destroy several lives. Daniel disagreed, but Rose had already made arrangements. Thomas would be adopted. He would grow up with a stable family, and Daniel was told to stay away. Daniel admitted that he didn't want to accept it. But Rose made him promise. She told him that if he truly loved their son, he would let him go. That sentence stayed with Daniel for the rest of his life. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She had spent days imagining Daniel as a man who had simply walked away from another woman and child. The truth was more complicated. He had wanted to stay. He had wanted to be a father, but he had made a promise, and that promise had become the first secret of his future marriage. Yet something still bothered Eleanor. If Daniel had been forced away from Thomas, why had he never told her? Why had he allowed her to believe his life began with her? The letter seemed to answer that question too. Daniel wrote that he met Eleanor shortly after Rose left. He had been broken, confused, ashamed. And then Eleanor came into his life. She gave him something he thought he had lost forever: hope. Daniel admitted that he loved Eleanor, not as a replacement for Rose, not because he had forgotten his past, but because he genuinely wanted a future with her. The problem was that he couldn't figure out how to tell her about the life that had existed before. Every year he intended to tell her. Every year he found a reason to wait. When they were newly married, he feared destroying their happiness. When Claire was born, he couldn't bear the thought of losing his family. When Michael arrived, the secret seemed even heavier. Then the children grew older. Then grandchildren arrived. And eventually, too much time had passed. Daniel had convinced himself that silence was safer than truth, but silence had never made the secret disappear. It had only allowed it to grow. Eleanor reached the end of the page. Then she noticed one sentence. She read it twice. "I tried to find Thomas many times, Eleanor, but Rose made me promise that I would never interfere with the life she had created for him." Eleanor lowered the letter. There was one problem. Daniel had said he tried, but Thomas had told her Daniel had actually found him, so Daniel's letter didn't explain everything. It created another mystery. When had Daniel broken his promise, and why? Eleanor couldn't accept the letter as the final answer. There were still too many unanswered questions. She needed to understand Rose, not the young woman from the photograph, not the name on the birth certificate, the woman she had become afterward, the woman who had carried this secret for decades. So Eleanor began searching for Rose's final years. She discovered that Rose had eventually left the city where Thomas was born. She had moved several times, worked different jobs, and lived a quiet life. Eventually, Eleanor found something she hadn't expected. Rose had died many years earlier. She had been buried in a small cemetery outside the town where she spent the final part of her life. Eleanor stood beside the grave for several minutes. She didn't know what she had expected to feel. Anger, perhaps, jealousy, resentment, but instead, she felt something strangely different. Pity. Rose had carried a secret too, perhaps even longer than Daniel. Eleanor wondered how many nights Rose had looked at the same stars and wondered whether Daniel had kept his promise. Then she found the name of a woman who had known Rose during her final years. Her name was Evelyn. Evelyn had been Rose's closest friend. When Eleanor explained why she was looking for her, Evelyn initially hesitated. She asked Eleanor why she wanted to know about a woman who had been dead for so long. Eleanor told her the truth. She had discovered an old photograph. She had found Thomas, and she had learned that Daniel had once loved Rose. Evelyn listened quietly. Then she told Eleanor something unexpected. Rose had never hated Daniel, not once. In fact, according to Evelyn, Rose had loved him until the end of her life. But love had not been enough to make her change her decision. Evelyn remembered Rose talking about Daniel. She remembered the regret in her voice. She remembered Rose saying that the hardest thing she had ever done was make Daniel walk away. Eleanor asked why. Evelyn finally gave her an answer. Because Rose believed that if Daniel stayed, everyone would lose. Evelyn explained what Rose had never told Eleanor. When Rose became pregnant, Daniel's family was already under enormous pressure. His father had built a respected business. Daniel was expected to take over. A scandal involving an unmarried young woman and a child would have destroyed the family's reputation. But that wasn't Rose's greatest fear. Her greatest fear was what would happen to Thomas. There had been people prepared to use the pregnancy against Daniel, people who wanted money, people who wanted control, people who threatened to make the child's life miserable if Daniel refused to cooperate. Rose believed Thomas could be protected only if he disappeared completely from Daniel's world, so she arranged the adoption. Daniel fought her. He begged her not to do it, but eventually he agreed, not because he stopped loving his son, because Rose convinced him that staying might put Thomas in greater danger. That was the decision Daniel had made when he was young, the decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He let his son go, and then he met Eleanor. But there was another part of the story, a part even Daniel's letter had not completely explained. Evelyn told Eleanor that Rose had kept something from Daniel. Rose had told Daniel that Thomas's adoptive family wanted no contact with his biological father, but according to Evelyn, that wasn't entirely true. The adoptive family had never known the full story. Rose had simply been afraid that Daniel would return, afraid that Thomas would discover everything, afraid that the life she had created for her son would collapse. So she kept Daniel away, for years, decades, until Daniel finally found a way to learn where Thomas was. Eleanor suddenly understood. Daniel hadn't stopped looking. He had simply looked in secret. When Eleanor returned home, she called Thomas. She needed to know the truth. She asked him when Daniel had contacted him. Thomas told her. It had been more than 20 years earlier. Daniel had found him after months of searching. He had approached carefully. He hadn't demanded to be recognized as his father. He hadn't asked Thomas for forgiveness. He simply told him who he was. Thomas had been furious. He had spent his entire childhood wondering why his biological parents had given him away. He had imagined dozens of explanations. He had wondered whether he had been unwanted, whether he had been a mistake, whether his biological father had simply abandoned him. Then Daniel told him the truth. He had wanted him. He had wanted to raise him. He had wanted to be there. But he had made a promise to Rose. Thomas didn't forgive him immediately. It took years. But Daniel kept coming back. Not every week, not every month. Sometimes only once a year. He never demanded anything. He simply stayed in contact, quietly, from a distance. And then Thomas revealed something that broke Eleanor's heart. Daniel had supported him financially several times. When Thomas started his first business, Daniel had anonymously helped him. When Thomas's wife became seriously ill, Daniel had sent money. When Thomas's first grandchild was born, Daniel had secretly sent a gift. Thomas had never known where all the help came from, until much later. Daniel had been watching from the shadows. He had never abandoned his son completely. He had simply never told Eleanor. And Eleanor finally understood the terrible contradiction at the center of Daniel's life. He had been faithful to Eleanor in the life they built together, but he had also carried a responsibility toward the son he had left behind. He had tried to honor both lives, and in doing so, he had lied to the woman who trusted him most. Eleanor sat alone that evening. The house was silent. For the first time in 52 years, she allowed herself to be completely angry with Daniel. She was angry that he hadn't trusted her, angry that he had allowed her to spend decades believing she knew everything about him, angry that Thomas had grown old without knowing his father openly, and angry that Daniel had died before she could ask him why. But beneath the anger was something she couldn't deny. Daniel had carried guilt. For decades, he had remembered Thomas. He had searched for him. He had helped him. He had loved him from a distance. That didn't make the deception right, but it made the story different from the one Eleanor had imagined. Thomas came to visit her a few days later. They sat together in the same kitchen where Eleanor had first discovered the photograph. Thomas looked around the room. He had never been there before, yet he recognized things from the stories Daniel had told him. The old clock, the blue coffee mug, the chair near the window. Daniel had described this room to him. He had described Eleanor too. Thomas told her that Daniel had spoken about her with enormous affection. He had never called her a burden, never called her an obstacle, never suggested that she had taken him away from his father. Quite the opposite. Daniel had told Thomas that Eleanor was the best thing that ever happened to him. That sentence hurt Eleanor more than she expected, because it meant Daniel's silence hadn't been born from a lack of love. It had been born from fear. Fear of losing the life he had built. Fear of hurting Eleanor. Fear of reopening a wound that had never truly healed. Thomas reached into his coat and removed another photograph. This one was different. It showed Daniel much older, standing outside Thomas's home. The picture had been taken years earlier. Eleanor stared at it. Daniel was smiling. Thomas was beside him. For the first time, Eleanor saw something she hadn't seen in the original photograph. Daniel wasn't looking at Rose. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Thomas, proudly, almost like a father. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She finally understood. Daniel had spent half a century carrying two truths. He had loved Eleanor, and he had loved the son he lost. He had never known how to make those truths exist openly in the same life, so he chose silence, and silence became the lie that followed him to his grave. Eleanor looked at Thomas, then at the photograph. She knew she couldn't change what Daniel had done. She couldn't recover the years. She couldn't give Thomas the childhood he should have had. and she couldn't erase the pain his secret had caused, but she could decide what happened next, because Daniel's secret no longer belonged only to the past. It had become part of the family standing in front of her, and Eleanor had one decision left to make: whether the truth would finally tear them apart, or whether it would give them a chance to become something none of them had expected. For the first time since Daniel's death, Eleanor realized that the question was no longer, why did he lie? The question was, what would she do with the truth? Eleanor remained seated at the kitchen table long after Thomas had gone. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet she had known before. For 52 years, silence had meant peace. That night, silence meant questions. She looked at Daniel's photograph, then at the letter, then at the second photograph Thomas had left behind. Daniel standing beside a grown man Eleanor had never known. Her husband had been living two lives, not two marriages, not two homes, but two histories, and Eleanor was only now discovering how deeply those histories had been connected. The next morning Eleanor woke before sunrise. She had barely slept. Every memory of Daniel seemed to have changed overnight. The first time he brought her flowers, the day they bought their first house, the birth of Claire, Michael's first steps, their anniversary celebrations, the arguments, the reconciliations, the ordinary mornings, the quiet evenings. For years, Eleanor had remembered those moments as proof that she and Daniel had shared everything. Now she wondered whether the word everything had ever been true. She walked through the house slowly. She stopped beside Daniel's old chair. She touched the armrest. And suddenly she was angry, not mildly disappointed, not simply hurt. Angry. She was angry that Daniel had made a decision for her. He had decided she couldn't handle the truth. He had decided that protecting their marriage was more important than allowing her to make her own choice. He had trusted her with his heart. He had trusted her with their children. He had trusted her with 52 years of his life, but he had not trusted her with his past. That realization hurt more than she expected. She whispered into the empty room, "Why didn't you tell me?" There was no answer. Of course there wasn't. Daniel was gone, and that was perhaps the cruelest part of all. She could forgive a living person after an honest conversation. She could argue. She could demand an explanation. She could walk away. But Daniel had left her with a truth she couldn't question him about. She sat down in his chair. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit something she had been afraid to say. She felt betrayed. But then another memory came. Daniel sitting beside her in the hospital when Claire was born. Daniel holding Michael for the first time. Daniel staying awake beside her during difficult nights. Daniel driving for hours to attend their daughter's graduation. Daniel becoming a grandfather. Those memories were still real. The secret hadn't erased them, and that made everything harder. Because Eleanor wasn't dealing with a villain, she was dealing with a complicated man she had loved for more than half a century. A man who had made a terrible decision when he was young. A man who had spent decades carrying the consequences. A man who had lied to her, and a man who had loved her deeply. How could all of those things be true at the same time? Eleanor didn't know. She only knew that 52 years of marriage could not be reduced to one photograph. Nor could one secret erase 52 years of love. But neither could 52 years of love make the secret disappear. She would have to decide what the truth meant to her. And before she could do that, she needed to hear Thomas's story. Not Daniel's, not Rose's, his. The child who had grown into a man. The child whose entire life had been shaped by a decision made before Eleanor even met Daniel. Thomas returned a few days later. This time, Eleanor didn't ask about Daniel immediately. She made tea. They sat quietly. There was something strangely natural about having him there. Perhaps because Thomas carried pieces of Daniel with him, the way he held his cup, the slight movement of his eyebrows when he was thinking, the habit of pausing before answering difficult questions. Eleanor recognized Daniel in him, but Thomas wasn't Daniel. He had lived his own life. He had his own wounds, his own memories, his own family, and Eleanor wanted to understand them. Thomas finally began to speak. He told Eleanor that growing up he had always wondered why he had been adopted. His adoptive parents had loved him. He never doubted that. They had given him a good childhood. They had attended his school events. They had celebrated his birthdays. They had been there when he married. But even surrounded by love, Thomas had carried one unanswered question. Why had his biological parents given him away? As a young man, he had imagined the worst. Maybe they didn't want him. Maybe he had been a mistake. Maybe his father had never cared. Then Daniel appeared. Thomas told Eleanor that their first meeting hadn't been beautiful. It hadn't been emotional. It had been awkward. There was anger, suspicion, pain. Thomas didn't immediately call Daniel Dad. For a long time he couldn't. Daniel understood. He never forced it. Instead, he came occasionally. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they barely spoke. Sometimes Daniel simply sat with him. Thomas told Eleanor that Daniel had never tried to rewrite the past. He didn't claim to have been a good father. He admitted that he had missed almost everything. Thomas's childhood, his first day at school, his teenage years, his wedding, the birth of his children, all the moments a father should have witnessed. Daniel couldn't give those years back, and he never pretended he could. But Thomas remembered one thing. Daniel always came back, even when Thomas was angry, even when Thomas told him not to come, even when their conversations ended badly. Daniel returned, quietly, patiently, without demanding forgiveness. Thomas looked at Eleanor. He told her that Daniel wasn't the father he had wanted, not because Daniel had been cruel, but because the father Thomas had wanted was a father who would have been there from the beginning, a father who would have taught him how to ride a bicycle, a father who would have attended his graduation, a father who would have stood beside him when he became a husband. Daniel couldn't become that man after 70 years, but he could become something else, someone who finally stopped running from the past. Thomas told Eleanor that he didn't hate him. He never had. He had been angry. He had been hurt. He had wished things were different. But hatred required forgetting everything else, and Thomas couldn't forget the man who had kept trying. Then Thomas said something that changed Eleanor's understanding of Daniel. He told her that during their final meeting, Daniel had spoken about her, not with guilt, with gratitude. Daniel had told Thomas that Eleanor had given him a life he never believed he deserved after losing Rose and Thomas. He had told him about their children, their grandchildren, their home, their ordinary evenings. He had spoken about Eleanor as though she were the center of the life he had built. Thomas said Daniel had once told him, "I don't expect you to forgive what I did, but I hope one day you understand why I couldn't stop loving you both." Eleanor looked away. Tears filled her eyes. For years, she had believed Daniel's secret had created two competing lives. Now she understood something more painful. Daniel had never stopped carrying both. He had simply been too afraid to let them meet. That evening, Eleanor returned to Daniel's room. She opened the old wooden box one final time. The photograph was still there. Rose, Daniel, Thomas. 3 people connected by a decision made more than 50 years ago. Eleanor touched Daniel's face in the photograph. She still felt angry. That hadn't disappeared. She wasn't going to pretend that it had. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't the same as saying something had been acceptable. Daniel's silence had hurt her. His decision had taken away her ability to choose how she would respond to the truth. She would never excuse that. But she could understand it. Daniel had been young, afraid, caught between love, responsibility, family pressure, and promises he didn't fully understand. Then he had spent decades trying to live with the consequences. He had made mistakes, but he had also tried to repair some of them. Quietly, imperfectly, too late. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about what would happen if she allowed Daniel's secret to remain a wound. The family could become divided. Claire might resent Thomas, Michael might blame Daniel, Thomas might feel like an outsider, and Eleanor could spend the rest of her life angry at a man who was no longer alive to defend himself. She didn't want that. Not for herself, not for Thomas, not for her children. She wanted something different. She wanted the truth to end the secrecy, not begin another one. Eleanor took a deep breath. Then she made a decision. She would tell Claire, she would tell Michael, and she would invite Thomas into the family. Not because blood erased 50 years of absence, not because forgiveness could restore lost time, but because Thomas had lost enough already. He didn't need to lose another family. Eleanor chose a Sunday afternoon, the same day the family usually gathered for lunch. Claire arrived first. Michael came shortly afterward. Neither knew why Eleanor had asked them to come. Then Thomas arrived. For several seconds nobody moved. Claire looked at him, then at her mother, then back at Thomas. She knew who he was, but knowing his name and seeing him standing in their home were two completely different things. Michael was the first to speak. He welcomed Thomas inside. The words were simple, but they mattered. Thomas sat at the table, the same table where Eleanor had first discovered the photograph, the same table where the family had once wondered whether Daniel had betrayed them. Now Thomas was sitting there, part of the story, part of the truth. At first the conversation was uncomfortable. There were long silences, questions nobody knew how to ask, memories that belonged to different people. Claire talked about Daniel as her father. Thomas talked about Daniel as the man who had found him late in life. Neither version was wrong. They were simply different pieces of the same man. Slowly the tension began to disappear. Thomas told them stories about Daniel they had never heard. Daniel's children learned things about their father that existed outside their own memories. Claire discovered that Daniel had once helped Thomas repair an old car. Michael learned that his father had attended one of Thomas's community events without telling anyone. Eleanor listened, and with every story, the image of Daniel became more complicated. Not better, not worse, just more human. Eventually, Claire asked Thomas about his childhood. Thomas spoke about his adoptive parents. He described their kindness, their sacrifices. The family realized something important. Thomas wasn't there to replace anyone. He wasn't asking for Daniel's belongings. He wasn't asking for a share of their childhood. He wasn't asking them to pretend that 50 years hadn't passed. He simply wanted to know where he came from, and they wanted to know him. By the end of the afternoon, the conversation had changed completely. People were laughing. Stories were being exchanged. Old photographs were brought out. Thomas found himself looking at pictures of a younger Daniel, pictures he had never seen. Eleanor watched him hold one photograph for a long time. It showed Daniel standing beside Claire and Michael when they were children. Thomas smiled. He didn't look jealous. He looked peaceful. For the first time, two separate branches of Daniel's life were sitting at the same table, not because the past had been repaired. It couldn't be. Not because the lost years had returned, they hadn't, but because the truth had finally given them a chance to stop living as strangers. Eleanor looked around the table. She thought about the photograph that had started everything. The young Daniel, Rose, the baby, a secret from another lifetime. She realized then that secrets don't disappear simply because the people who created them are gone. They wait, sometimes for decades, until someone is brave enough to open the box. But Eleanor had learned something else. A truth can hurt. It can break the picture you once had of someone. It can force you to question memories you thought were permanent. But sometimes, once the truth is finally spoken, it can also make room for something new. Eleanor looked at Thomas, then at Claire and Michael, and for the first time since Daniel's death, she didn't feel as though something had been taken from her. She felt as though something had finally been returned. Not the years, not the childhood Thomas had lost, not the honesty Daniel should have given her. Something simpler, a chance for people who had been separated by one man's secret, to finally sit together without one. And Eleanor understood that perhaps this was what love left behind, not perfection, not a life without mistakes, but the possibility that even after everything has gone wrong, someone can still choose what happens next. And for Eleanor, the next chapter was only beginning. The months that followed did not erase what had happened. They didn't erase the years Daniel had kept the truth from Eleanor. They didn't restore the childhood Thomas had lost. And they didn't magically turn a complicated past into a simple one. But something changed. For the first time, the family wasn't carrying the secret separately. They were carrying the truth together, and that made all the difference. As the months passed, Eleanor slowly began rebuilding her life. At first, the changes were small. She started taking morning walks again. She began spending more time in the garden. She opened the curtains in Daniel's room instead of keeping them closed. She even returned to the little cafe where she and Thomas had first met. But perhaps the biggest change was the way she began looking at her own memories. For weeks after Daniel's death, Eleanor had been afraid that every beautiful memory would become painful once she knew the truth. Instead, something unexpected happened. The memories remained. Her wedding day was still beautiful. The birth of Claire and Michael was still beautiful. The years of raising their children were still real. The laughter, the arguments, the holidays, the quiet evenings, the grandchildren, none of those things had been erased. Daniel's secret had changed the story, but it hadn't erased the love that had existed inside it. Eleanor slowly learned to hold two truths at the same time. Daniel had hurt her, and Daniel had loved her. He had made a terrible decision, and he had spent much of his life trying to live responsibly with that decision. He had kept a secret, and he had eventually tried to repair part of the damage. None of those truths canceled the others. They simply made Daniel human, and perhaps that was the hardest lesson Eleanor had learned. People could make terrible choices and still love deeply. People could do the wrong thing for reasons they believed were right. And sometimes, the consequences of one decision could follow a person for an entire lifetime. Thomas gradually became a regular part of the family. At first, he visited occasionally, then once every few weeks. Eventually, nobody needed a special reason for him to come. He simply belonged. He learned where Eleanor kept the tea. He developed his own place at the kitchen table. He helped Michael repair things around the house. He exchanged stories with Claire, and slowly the awkwardness disappeared. One afternoon, Eleanor found Thomas looking through an old family album. He stopped at a photograph of Daniel holding Claire as a baby. Thomas stared at it quietly. Eleanor sat beside him. Neither spoke for a while. Then Thomas smiled. He told Eleanor that for years he had wondered what his father looked like when he was happy. Now he knew. Eleanor looked at the photograph. She realized something. Thomas had not come into their lives to take Daniel's place. He had come into their lives to finally understand him, and in the process, the family had learned to understand Thomas. Eleanor also began visiting Rose's grave. She didn't go often, and she never spoke aloud. But she would stand there for a few minutes and think about the young woman in the photograph, the woman she had once imagined as a rival. Now she saw her differently. Rose had been young, frightened, a mother trying to protect her child. She had made choices too, some right, some wrong. Just like Daniel, just like Eleanor, just like everyone. Eleanor finally understood that the past wasn't divided into heroes and villains. It was made of frightened people making decisions with the knowledge they had at the time. That didn't excuse everything, but it made forgiveness possible. Nearly a year after Daniel's death, Eleanor decided to clear the last few boxes from the attic. She had been avoiding them. There were things she wasn't ready to touch. Old clothes, family albums, receipts, Christmas decorations, Daniel's handwritten notes. She opened one box, then another. Nothing surprised her, until she found a small envelope hidden beneath a stack of old papers. There was no name on it, no date, no explanation, just Eleanor's name. Her heart began beating faster. She sat down on the floor. For a moment, she considered leaving it unopened. She had already discovered enough secrets for one lifetime, but eventually she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Daniel's handwriting. The words were short, but they carried the weight of 52 years. He apologized, not for loving Thomas, not for loving Rose when he was young, not for the mistakes of his past. He apologized for making Eleanor live beside him without knowing the whole truth. He admitted that there had been countless moments when he almost told her. After their 10th anniversary, after Michael was born, after their children left home, even after becoming a grandfather, each time, fear stopped him. Fear that Eleanor would see him differently, fear that she would believe their marriage had been built on a lie, fear that telling her the truth would destroy the family he had spent his life protecting. But in the end, Daniel admitted that his silence had not protected Eleanor, it had simply taken away her choice. And he regretted that. Then he wrote something that made Eleanor stop reading. He said that if she ever discovered the truth after he was gone, he hoped she wouldn't remember him only for the secret. He hoped she would remember the ordinary things, the mornings, the laughter, the children, the grandchildren, the nights they stayed awake talking, the arguments they eventually laughed about, the life they had built. Then came the final line. Daniel wrote, "I should have trusted you with the truth. I was afraid of losing you, but I never understood that love without honesty leaves the other person carrying a burden they never agreed to carry." Eleanor lowered the paper. She cried. Not the angry tears she had shed months earlier, not the tears of betrayal. These were different. They were the tears of someone finally hearing an apology from the person who could no longer give it in person. She folded the letter carefully, then placed it inside the same wooden box where the photograph had been found. But this time she didn't lock the box. She left it open. The following morning, Eleanor went to Daniel's grave. She carried no flowers. She carried no photograph, only herself. She stood there quietly. For a long time she said nothing. Then she finally spoke. She told Daniel that she was still angry. She told him that she wished he had trusted her. She told him there were things she would never understand. But she also told him something else. She thanked him for the good years, for their children, for their grandchildren, for the life they had built, and for leaving behind a truth that, painful as it was, had brought Thomas into the family. Eleanor didn't tell Daniel that everything was forgiven, because she knew life wasn't that simple. Some wounds heal without disappearing, some memories remain painful even after forgiveness, and some questions never receive perfect answers. But Eleanor no longer needed a perfect answer. She had spent months trying to decide whether the truth made her 52 years of marriage a lie. Standing beside Daniel's grave, she finally understood. It hadn't been a lie. It had been a real marriage containing an enormous secret, a real love story shaped by human weakness, fear, sacrifice, mistakes, and forgiveness. Daniel had been imperfect. So had she. So had Rose. So had everyone who had touched the story. But the past was finished. Eleanor couldn't change it. She could only decide what to do with what remained. She turned away from the grave, and for the first time since Daniel's death, she didn't feel as though she was walking away from him. She felt as though she was walking forward. Months later, Eleanor would sometimes sit beneath the old tree in her garden. Thomas would visit. Claire and Michael would bring the grandchildren. There would be laughter around the same table where the photograph had once shattered everything Eleanor believed about her husband. And sometimes, when the family was together, Eleanor would look around and think about how differently the story could have ended. The secret could have destroyed them. Instead, the truth gave them something unexpected. A second chance. Not a second chance to change the past. That was impossible. A second chance to change what the past meant. Because sometimes love doesn't survive because it was perfect. Sometimes it survives because, after discovering the truth, we decide there is still something worth saving. And sometimes the greatest second chance isn't getting back what we lost. It's finding something new, because we finally stopped running from the truth. Eleanor had spent 52 years believing her story had already been written. She discovered that she was wrong. There was still another chapter, and perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside all our lives. It is never too late to discover the truth, never too late to forgive what can be forgiven, never too late to make peace with what cannot be changed, and never too late to begin another chapter, because dreams don't have an expiration date, and neither does hope. So, if you were Eleanor, tell us honestly, would you have forgiven Daniel after discovering the truth? Would you have wanted to know everything after 52 years? Or would some secrets be better left buried? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe that love, hope, and second chances don't belong only to the young, subscribe to Dreams Never Grow Old, because sometimes the most meaningful chapter of a person's life is the one they never expected to write.